Check, check. Hello, hello, hello. Where am I going to stand? I don't want to be in the way of the screen. Awesome. So I am going to keep this brief because most of you know me. We do have a lot of new faces tonight, which is brilliant to see. So welcome. So yeah, it's worth running through this and just keeping everyone up to scratch. And we've got some stuff to talk about with Evolve and things as well. But I am going to keep it very brief because, yeah, we've got some really cool stuff to talk about tonight. And there's a lot of cool name badges out there tonight as well that aren't this analog. So yeah, we will speed through it. So breaking breadboards, most of you know us by now, but this is the best way to explain us. So we were four of us that wanted to try and cater to people in Brighton that met hardware and software together. So there's lots of groups out there at the moment, which I'll come to in a minute, but there weren't any or aren't any. I know there's lots of stuff going on, unis and things like that, but there weren't any kind of independent groups that look at hardware. So this is a very good way to explain us. The only caveat to any project you're working on is it has to have some hardware involved. If it does, then we'd love to see it. We'd love you to talk about it. So yeah, that's basically why we're all here. This is a little rundown of the evening. So you're probably aware that we are now in this section. After this, John's going to take you through. We do run a little name badge kind of, we were calling it a competition, but I guess it's kind of like a little interactive section. So we encourage everyone to make their own name badges in a hardware style of your choice. So it can be as complicated or as simple as you like. So yeah, John's going to run you through that. And then we've got the great Dan Makes Things here tonight, who's going to run you through some robots and things. And then we'll have a little bit of, we usually go to the pub afterwards and socialize and just kind of wrap things up there as well. So this is something that we've been trying to get people involved with as well, is we have a Slack group between the events. So you can scan this. I think we normally have some things around on the side, or you can ask, yeah, just over there. My handy helpers are pointing them out. Or you can, you can find us on Slack, but sometimes Slack is not the easiest to navigate straight into our chat. If you're already in the Silicon Brighton kind of family of chats, then you can just search for us in there, Breaking Breadboards, and add that into your chat. Yeah, I'd never realized how confusing Slack is until I started trying to get people to use it. So yeah, there you go. So yeah, we are very, very gratefully supported by Silicon Brighton. So they support around 40 meetup groups in Brighton now, and they keep us running. They help to provide the spaces and keep all this free for everyone. It's all volunteer time and everything like that. So I know that some people in the room organize some of these events, so I'm very much preaching to the converted. But if you haven't been along to some of the others, I would highly recommend it. There's lots going on in the city, and just speaking to some other people here tonight, it's not always the case. I think we hugely take it for granted that we have this network in Brighton. My siblings are up in Leeds, and I know that this doesn't exist, not to this scale at least. So yeah, I was speaking to people tonight that have kind of run groups before and had a very different experience to what we've had. So yeah, let me just move it on. Whoop. Skipping through. So Silicon Brighton itself is supported by businesses in the city. So these are some of the supporters of Silicon Brighton. And this page is just some of the bigger supporters. And go through to this one. So yeah, Silicon Brighton, nice and easy, siliconbrighton.com, or you can scan this. Like I say, most of you are familiar with them anyway, but if you want to find out more, siliconbrighton.com. We got a slide on. Yeah, so these are some of the upcoming events. Like I said, just a small sampling. So we've got Brighton Data Forum on the 29th of Jan, Women in Tech also on the 29th of Jan, I think. Is that right? Yeah, it's the 29th of Jan. PHP Sussex, 12th of Feb, Brighton AI, 5th of Feb. So again, just a small idea of what's going on there. Perfect. Just before I hand you over to Maya to talk about the wonderful space that we're in, there is also Evolve, which is happening on the 4th of July. So we are still kind of confirming what our involvement will be. We've had some questions tonight about kind of what hardware stuff is going to be there and stuff. Watch this space. Basically, it's just going to be the meetup of all meetups is kind of how the Silicon Brighton team are describing it. So they're encouraging all of the meetup organizers to kind of be involved, and there'll be local businesses and different events and hopefully workshops and things going on as part of that as well. So yeah, at the minute, I think we're just trying to get the, am I right in thinking we're just kind of getting the word out around the date and finding out a bit more info and stuff. Perfect. So yeah, you can scan that, or again, siliconbrighton.com for more details. And now I'm going to hand you over to Maya.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Lots of new faces here, which is great. Welcome to Freedom Works. My name is Maya. I am the community manager here. We are a co-working space for those of you who don't know. We offer flexible co-working options across the South Coast. So we've got 10 sites now. This was the newest one, but now we've got one in Horsham. We've also recently just taken over Platform 9 as well, which is we've got one in Brighton and one in Hove too. Our managing director always says that we want to get to the moon. So we are slowly getting there. But we try to offer a lot more than that, try and really focus on the community kind of aspect of it all. So we do that by hosting kind of events like this one, really trying to get into the community there, and then also hold members lunches with our members. We do like charity bake sales and free beer Fridays, which are always very popular. And yeah, so we offer like hot desking, meeting rooms where you can do it pay as you go, or subscriptions, but we also have private offices as well. If anyone is interested in anything or wants to know more, I've got leaflets just dotted around here. And yeah, and you can get in contact and I can speak to you more about that. Yeah.
Perfect. So Nickel very kindly helped us out with pizzas tonight. So big round of applause for Nickel, please. Although he told me not to say that, he's a very humble man, but we're very grateful, Nickel. And I'm going to hand you over to John to do name badges because, yeah, my offering is very poor tonight. So I thought John is definitely a big step up. So yeah, I'll let John take it from here.
Hello. Yes, I'm John. So I introduced the name badge world. Before I do that, just going back to the pizza and sponsor piece. We're really grateful to the sponsors. They enable us to do this. We couldn't be here, without our friends giving us this space, without Silicon Brighton. We also would love to find some companies to help us fund pizza and drinks and stuff. If you know anyone, if your employer would love to just get their name out there a little bit and give us, £100 every, whatever it is, every other month to fund pizza, we'd love to talk about it. So if you have an idea like that, please do grab one of the organizers and we can sort that out, and we'd love to hear. Please get in touch. So name badges. Now, there are some name badges in the audience. We've all talked about mine before, which is Pico-powered one. So who would like to come and see a name badge? Richard, do you want to tell us a little bit about your amazing name badge?
Right, this is an ESP8266. It's the smaller version, and it's plugged into a terminal strip for the larger version of the Node MCU ESP8266, which happens to give 4 spare sockets where, oh look, the display just fits in there, which is rather convenient. The whole thing is really more of a demonstration thing that I put together for young people in Coder Dojo. But I thought last night, well, I can just put my name on there, and had an interesting time fiddling around with the graphics, doing what I hadn't done before. As it's an ESP8266, of course, it comes with Wi-Fi. So I've got the default web page that comes with
Cam here. Cam there.
Cam there, yes, okay. Sorry. That's not really, that's blank, isn't it?
And here we have a blank screen.
Yes, here we have a blank screen.
We've seen them before. That's always what my code does.
Right, try that. So the top button there that says toggle LED is one of the default programs that you get with the ESP8266, and the LED should No, nothing works. Yeah, there we go. There we go. So the LED is working.
It takes time for those variables to
Yes,
go down the line.
and there's a few other things like humidity and temperature and a relay. I should be able to change the temperature there. I don't know if you want to see the temperature. Does that work? Should give temperature and humidity.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not sure anything. The people online have the better review of this than anyone
Right.
else. But,
Okay.
but no, it's cool.
So there it is.
Thank you, Richard. Wonderful. Right, I've seen some others. Please. And you're a number rather than
I'm a number rather than a name today. Yeah, change my name on people. So I came across this chap, Michael de Boer, or I don't know how to say his name, but he did these loads of like different multiple segment designs, and I was rather inspired by them and thought they were really cool and wanted a clock with one of the designs. So I thought I'd have a go. So this is what I've come up with. This is just a single digit prototype board. So what I did is at work, we've got a PCB mill. So I was able to just do a couple of test boards. So it's just NeoPixels, mini NeoPixels, daisy chained, and 9 for this 9 segment display.
You have a PCB mill. We all need to get to know you really, really well.
Yeah, I mean, slip me a fiver and I'm sure we can.
No. I have to wait for 10 days for mine to come from China.
Well, I mean, it is good and it's really good for rapid prototyping, but you do have to worry about things like copper not being removed underneath the chips, which normally would be covered by solder mask. So that's why I had to make a second one, because I forgot about that. And then, a 3D printed frame which has all the segments in, and then it just stacks up. And then on the front, I've just stuck some paper. But I think for the actual clock, I'm going to get some like frosted acrylic or something like that to go with the front.
It looks really cool. I must admit, the curves are beautiful, and the diffusion off of those WS2812Bs is working really nicely.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty happy with it. So so hopefully I'll bring a clock in the next meet, or maybe the one after.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right. So, any other name badges or just Chessons? Please come on. This is version 3.
No, version 1 in many ways. Okay, so I wanted to. So finally, I have a name badge that I can show. I wanted to go for something over-engineered, basically. So I started with. I like. Personally, I like building things that are kind of connected to the internet and allow other people to interact with them. I know that doesn't really necessarily make sense for a name badge, but anyway, my first idea was to basically try and get a Google Doc shrunk down onto this tiny screen. But I was doing all of this on a Raspberry Pi 202, which does not have the RAM to open that. So instead, what I've done is I've made my own web page. So this is actually running Chromium, which is again totally massively over-engineered with this. If you went to my talk at Async recently, you might have seen, or the show and tell at Async before Christmas, you might have seen that I did a sort of like multiplayer kind of pixel art thing. It turns out that was 128 by 128 pixels, which is the exact size of the screen. So I ditched Google Docs and I use this. I had to make a new version of it that used a lot less memory, but it does work. It runs in Chrome, and you can actually go online. I don't have the URL to show you, but you can go online and start messing around with it. So if anyone remembers that URL, it's place.checkbox.com. If you go there, you can edit it and change my name if you want to. Yeah, I know. Oh, I've regretted it before. Don't worry. I imagine I'll continue to regret it. That's it. So yeah, my plan for the future version of this is try and get like a Pi Pico version. This is version 2, because the first one I sort of tried to remove all the headers from the screen and then solder some quite small wires onto a Pico, and I fried it basically. But this one works. It's all good. Yeah.
It is a really nice screen as well. Oh, thank you. Cool. Have I missed any name badges? No? Brilliant. Well, thank you. Please do keep making digital name badges and bringing them on. We love hearing about them. We love seeing the journey. And I'm sure it inspires everyone else to try and want to move on to the next. So, events in the future, we've already talked about Evolve. Maker Central is also coming up, which also might be something we want to do. And so keep that in mind and those dates sort of in your mind. And let's move on to the main speaker. So I'm delighted to say that we have Dan Nicholson all the way from the other end of England. All the way from Northumberland. We have to bring people down from Northumberland to talk because that's where the best engineers live. And he's better known as Dan Makes Things. And yeah, we want to hear all about the robot. Thank you.
Before we start, is this a good place? Can you all see me? Can you all hear me? Sound like I'm from Harry Potter. Okay, would you mind swapping the clicker at all? I'll go with that, and I'll grab my water. I have to apologize. I'm 2 weeks out of a really bad cold, and so there might be some coughing and some drinking. Non-alcoholic, of course. So I don't have a name badge. I feel quite guilty about that, but my name is Dan, and I make things. And over the last few years, possibly against my better judgment, I've been building this guy, and he is a desktop companion robot. I've been invited here today to talk to you not just about the project and the build itself, but also about my journey, because when I started this, I really didn't have the knowledge and experience that I needed for a project like this, and it has taken me a long, long time to acquire that knowledge. So what I wanted to do was really talk to you about that journey as well, the challenges that I faced, the various iterations, of course, as well, and how technology that is available has changed over time just during the lifetime of the project that has, in fact, completely changed the direction of the project because of those improvements and those new availabilities. If there is one thing I'd like you to take away from tonight, it is that if I can build a robot like this, then you can too. In fact, you can build this one if you really want to, because it's all open source and accessible. So before I start, can I see a little show of hands about what kind of level of experience I'm talking to in here? So how many of you have nothing, are very just starting out with electronics or robotics, or are just interested, or maybe got dragged here by a friend? Okay, so this is a few, that's good. Okay. We've got that one. How many maybe are a little bit more experienced, but not on a professional level? Okay, nice to see. And how many are professionally using robotics or electronics or any of those kind of related fields? Okay, I'll watch out for you guys for the questions later. That's good. I'm not at all nervous. Okay, so as I mentioned, who am I first of all? I'm a software engineer. I've been a software engineer for around 20 years. That's how I studied. That's what I've been doing the entire time. Right now, I manage a team of about 20 people in a telecoms company, so nothing to do with this at all. And I started this during lockdown. And the idea really was COVID was everywhere. We were all stuck in the house. I had a little girl, my wife, with us, and I wanted to make something that would maybe be interesting to her at that age that she could interact with. And I didn't know how to do that at all. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about what that took and where we go with that in a second. As I mentioned, I'm from the Northeast. There isn't very many events like this in the Northeast, so I'm very pleased to be here. I'm pleased you all could attend. It took me 6 hours to get here, so if I look a little disheveled, that's why. So when I started looking at the project and what I wanted to build, again, ignorance is bliss. I had no idea how hard it would be to do the things that I was trying to do. And so I really just wanted to make something that I could conjure out of my brain. And I thought, if I try hard enough, I'll make it real. And it didn't look anything like this. I wanted to build a desktop companion. I wanted to have something that I could have and I could interact with. I didn't want it to be a puppet. So you see a lot of robots online where they are controlling them, with a keyboard or with a little games console or whatever. I wanted something so that when I spoke to it, or when it saw me, or when it used one of the other senses, it could interact with me in a, hopefully natural way. I was aiming quite high, I think it's fair to say. The other thing that I appreciated early on was the idea that it would need to be fairly modular. I didn't want to have to rebuild the entire project every time I upgraded. I knew I would need to upgrade and iterate on designs because that's how it works in software, and I assumed that would be doubly so for hardware. And I wanted it to be easy to upgrade. And then, more importantly than that almost, I wanted it to be open source. And the reason for that is that, as I've mentioned, my knowledge wasn't professionally gained. It was all gained through YouTube, through people's blog posts, through other example projects. And I really wanted to be able to pay that forward and share the experiences and the knowledge that I've gained as I built the project. So I wanted it to be open source, but more than that, I wanted it to be accessible. Because one of the challenges that we have in hobby robotics is price, and is sourcing parts, and is being able to reproduce something that you see online. So all of the decisions that I made about hardware and about software as well was about how can I make it something that anybody can build, even if they don't have the experience, as long as they have that determination, just the same as I did. And then, of course, finally, I really wanted it to be fun because I work with computers all day. I really didn't want to be doing the hard work. I wanted to be doing the fun bits. And then the project kind of tilted in that direction where I focused on the things that were the most fun to me. And this is why you end up with something that looks a little bit like that. So my initial concept was not at all like this. It was a cube. And the idea was this cube would sit on the bench, and then when it sensed somebody's presence, it would rise up off the base and it could animate, similar to how you see on the video there. It would have slits with neopixels, which are addressable multicolor LEDs, so that I could have colors pulsing through it, some sort of emotional animation or whatever it might be. And then it actually had a piece in the mouth that held a tiny camera so that it could focus and track people's faces. Again, I didn't know what I couldn't do, and I found out quite quickly that I couldn't do that. The problem was that even though that was quite a large box, fitting all of the components inside and still allowing it to actuate just really wasn't feasible. It might be now, to be fair, but when I was started out with this a few years ago, there just really wasn't the room inside to do that kind of thing. So I gave up on that. And I started looking at ideas for what I might want to build. And at the time that I was revising my design, I was also playing a game which was Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. I don't know if people have played it. It's quite popular. I assume some of you have. But there is a character in that game that is a companion to your character, the protagonist, called BD-1. And it is a bipedal robot droid that follows the character around and helps them in their tasks. And they very quickly make you fall in love with that character in the game. It is one of the key themes of the game is your relationship with this droid and how they interact. And I thought, you know what, I'll just build that. It'll be fine. What could go wrong? And so I started, again, I didn't have a 3D printer. I didn't have 3D modeling experience. I had no idea what I was getting into. And the bottom right picture that you can see there is before I had a 3D printer, trying to build something out of wood. So you can see the amount of effort that would have taken, and the hassle to kind of get to the point where I am now, which just wouldn't have been possible without accessible 3D printers and all of the modeling tools that we have available. Some of these other designs are using a program called Tinkercad, which is an online, really easy to learn tool, but quite limiting when you start to get into the more advanced stuff. But again, I just wanted to have 20 minutes here, half an hour there, just to try and learn all of these things as I went. I wanted to focus on the fun stuff. So I started with Tinkercad. I worked my way through. You can see there's some kind of 3D printed servo horn attachments that maybe would have done what I needed. You can see a first iteration of the neck, which would pop up off the body and so on. And I eventually learned enough to be able to model the entire thing. And it wasn't great. It didn't work very well, as you'll see. But the features that I kind of dreamt up as I was going through this started to take shape. And so I had the idea that I wanted it to hear me, I wanted it to understand me, and I knew limited amounts of things about how that would work. I knew that I could use Python, and there were frameworks or libraries that you could use to make that happen. Motion sensing, I thought, would be an easy, quick win because you can use things like PIR sensors. Or what it has is a microwave sensor, which is the same basic idea that it tracks motion, but it doesn't need line of sight, so it can actually track motion through walls. So the idea was, well, okay, if there is no motion sensing, we assume that the person has left the room. Well, go to sleep. Don't waste battery power, don't waste energy, don't burn out your servos, just relax. Animation was another one, bit off way more than I could chew, but I built a lightweight animation framework that uses JSON files, which are effectively just templates, if you like, for the animations that it would do. So it can load a file, read the various steps that it would like each of the servos to do with timings, and then do basic animations like standing or nodding its head or doing those kinds of things. Again, took a long time, but got it working in the end. The kind of outputs that I was looking for initially, I didn't want to go for speakers because, again, the character I was basing it off didn't speak. It beeped, it does this kind of droid speak thing. And I actually coincidentally had written something for the Arduino a few years earlier that I called Braille Speak. The idea behind that was it takes a character and it turns it into 2 tones and then outputs those tones in sequence. So theoretically, you could type a phrase and have it output the phrase, and you could hear the tones and learn what it was saying. So you could understand it very much the same way as they do in the films. Now, I will confess, I have never learned the language, and I don't think anybody has, but it's there and it's available and it's open source. It also has a color-coded equivalent. So if you didn't want the noise and you just wanted a light that changed color, you could do that as well. I don't recommend that you learn this language, by the way. It's not worth it. But anyway, facial detection and recognition was another big one. Again, I really wanted that interaction. And even from that early days with the wooden version, I wanted to have that kind of face tracking. I was working on that side of things. But there's a difference here if you're not clear on the concepts. Facial detection is, it sees a face, it knows it's a face, and then you can do whatever you want with that information. Facial recognition takes it a step further and says, I know who that is based on training that I've received and example images, much in the same way that you have with most of these models these days. And what I did for the earlier version was have it so that if it didn't know a face, it would take a capture of the face, the whole image, and then crop it to just that head, if you like. And it would store it in a folder. And then I could go in and create named folders and sort all of these faces that it had seen. And then overnight, while it was having its downtime, it would go to sleep and it would dream and retrain the model. And then in the morning, it would recognize people that it didn't recognize the day before. And it was stuff like that that kept me interested and kept me kind of focusing on these new things that I'd never done before. Auto shutdown was a really important part because of the battery, because the challenge with lithium ion batteries and so on is you really can't run them lower than a certain voltage. It isn't like a TV remote where you stick a AA in, when it stops working, you can throw it away, or you can recharge it. You need to monitor that carefully. And you'll see on the front of the body is a little display, which is actually solely for monitoring the voltage of the batteries. The idea there was you can pipe that into an Arduino and have it so that it monitors the voltage and then shuts down the Raspberry Pi if the voltage gets too low, so you don't risk damaging your batteries. Things like that are all kind of included in some of these versions that I built. Because I needed all of this complex stuff in a small space, I started also looking at custom PCBs. So you can see the list of tools and technologies that I needed to learn quickly began to grow. PCB design and PCB manufacturing is relatively straightforward. But again, I was aiming for accessibility, so I didn't really feel like I had a choice. I wanted to make PCBs so people could take the files, get them printed themselves. Sometimes I see people at events and can hand out a few. I don't have any today, I'm sorry, I ran out. But it meant that it just kind of knocked down another barrier to people getting involved in building the project for themselves, because they could just print the PCB rather than having to wire everything up and deal with all of that themselves. And then finally, I realized very early on it needed to be 3D printed from an accessibility point of view as much as anything, but also because I just never would have built it otherwise. Taking pieces of wood or machine shopping pieces of metal, I just wouldn't have done that because I'm not that way inclined. I don't have the room. 3D print is a beautiful alternative. And as you can see, everything on there, apart from the components that you need to purchase, is 3D printed. And if I have a choice, I'll go for a 3D printed option rather than buying something, because you buy another thing, it's another thing that other people have to source as well. So this was version 1. It looks very different to the one that we have right now. It was very bulky, but it did work. It stood up, it sat down again. The neck mechanism would also kind of expand and retract into the head. And it had very basic face detection and tracking. Now you can see the mess of wires that go on inside that, and you can see the legs themselves are, very, very thin, quick prints, because I have an Ender 3, which many of you are involved in 3D printing. It's like well known for being awful. So I didn't want to have to do a huge amount of work on this first version. And it was a proof of concept. It was let's just get it working. Let's just see what I can do. I was never happy with it. It was far too big. I didn't want to, I didn't want to take it places. I didn't want to carry it around. And also because I had such kind of hard time getting all that wiring in place in the right way, I couldn't fit batteries in particularly well without causing a fire risk. So I quickly moved on, and I decided I really wanted to slim it down. So for version 2, you can see the difference. Again, still using Tinkercad, doing all of this in an easy open source framework. You can see the size difference between the first version and the second version. Now you'll notice that the second version is not this version either. We'll get there. But this one was my first real kind of version that I shared with people, that made people interested in the project. The whole time I was doing this, I was sharing what I was working on things like Instagram, where I would share posts or reels. I will confess, I don't use Instagram personally. I don't particularly do anything like that. So this was all to pay that forward. This was all to kind of give people that awareness of the project. And I quickly found that it was received quite well. People were interested in it, so it kind of encouraged me to do more and maybe move forward faster with it than I would have done otherwise. So that was really kind of rewarding to see. So this is the first functional prototype of version 2. You can see it stands up. It's got smaller servos, very similar kind of situation with the legs, but I kind of redesigned them to be clamping down on the servo output itself so that it was all quite slim. And then this one ran off both battery and USB-C so that I could take it somewhere if I needed to. Balance wasn't amazing. I hadn't put that in place yet, but I was generally really happy with this. So it's actually got, although you can't really see on this design, it's actually got a Raspberry Pi in the head. And so the Raspberry Pi would control the kind of higher brain function, and the Arduino would be the thing that controlled the body. So the legs and the neck, all of those servos were controlled via the Arduino, and it connected via a serial connection to the Raspberry Pi in the head. And that gave me some interesting options, because it meant I could do battery monitoring, because I could feed the battery voltage via a voltage divider into the Arduino and have it just inform the Raspberry Pi what the voltage was periodically. I could also do things like monitor the temperature of the Raspberry Pi during using its inbuilt stuff, and kind of started to build a framework of modules that I could use and reuse and modify as I needed to. And so it gave me a lot of hope, because for me, that was the first one that I actually was quite proud of. And I went, bear in mind, from a box that didn't work, that couldn't move, that didn't have the power to lift itself up off its base, to something that actually was quite cute and was getting in the direction that I wanted it to be. And there's a couple of other examples here. So the one on the left is a slow motion video where I turned it on too fast and it shot up, just showing the power of the servos. But I thought it was quite funny because it leaps up like a baby deer. And then the one on the right is actually, the text is me talking. I've killed the sound, but I could tell it to like turn the flashlight on or ask it a question. And the animations would, shake the head or nod the head depending on it. And that was all completely automated. I wasn't pre-scripting it. I would say, if you've been asked a question and that doesn't lead to another path in the software, then give me a yes or no answer. And it would remember the previous time it had been asked that question, so it would give a consistent answer every time, which is obviously quite fun. And you can see the first version of the voltage monitor on the front there, where it actually shone through a very thin layer of PLA plastic that I 3D printed. So when it was turned off, you couldn't see that display at all, which was quite nice. And then something interesting happened. Out of nowhere, I got tagged on Instagram, and it was a guy over in Texas who had very quietly, without reaching out to me first, without kind of explaining that he was doing it, downloaded the files, printed them on his own printer, downloaded the software, installed it on the Raspberry Pi, and got his own version working, and effectively cloned it in this very cool looking black theme. And he tagged me, and it was one of these moments where I realized the impact that this project could have, because not only was it something that I was enjoying sharing with people and people were like to see, but other people were building things and potentially modifying it themselves. And I was coming to the end of that version 2. And so I started to think, well, what can I do to really make it better for people? What can I do to make it more accessible? What can I do to make more people get benefit from the work that I'm doing, rather than having to retrace those steps themselves? So then came version 3, and we're still not there yet. You'll notice it's different, but we're getting there. Version 3, the real focus there was start again from scratch. The legs on version 2, very thin still, very difficult. You know, I was working under the delusion that I could get it walking quite quickly. And so I thought, if I make stronger legs, I'll be able to do more with that side of things. The body is also modular, so it's 3 main sections. The bottom section contains the power circuitry, if you like. The middle is the battery, and the top is the Arduino and the wiring for all of those different areas. And the idea then is, well, if someone wants to redesign that to fit a different type of battery, and they just need to reprint one section, screw it all together, and they're done. And similarly, the head, the whole head for that version 3 also allowed you to hot swap components as well if you needed to, and kind of reconfigure things. And you'll notice on the top of this as well, there is a Coral USB accelerator. And that's a plug-in device that you can connect to a Raspberry Pi or another computer, and it allows you to offload some of the kind of AI and machine learning capabilities in runtime, so that the Raspberry Pi is freed up to do other things. Now, at this point, I was using a Raspberry Pi 3B+, which is not the fastest when it comes to this stuff. And so when you're doing facial detection, it wasn't real time. So you'd walk across the room, and it would maybe track you, or maybe you'd move too far and you'd go out of the range of the camera. Tried wide angle lenses to see if that would help, but really it only consistently tracked you about half the time, and you had to wait a while for it to catch up. So I was looking for things to try and make that aspect better. But the problem with the Coral USB accelerator is it uses a load of power, and it was about 70 pounds at the time. And the project is not an expensive project, so asking people to fork out another 70 pounds just to get that kind of additional investment in speed was quite a difficult ask. So it never really sat very comfortably with me. And we'll come back to that, because there is an upgrade. So you can see a couple of the versions here, and you can see it's standing. I will turn this on in the room, by the way. I'm just terrified of it falling over, so let me be over there when we do that. But it does stand, and it does balance, and the servos are powerful enough. I get a lot of questions about, you know, can it hold its own weight? Can it stand? Can it sit? It took a long time to understand how do you calculate things like stall torque, and how that relates to leg length, and how that relates to inverse kinematics, and all of these things that I had no idea about when I started. But it's been a really interesting journey, and I think for me, the learning about this stuff is more valuable than the project itself. So it's been a really interesting one to do. So then we come to version 4. This is this one. And version 4, I realized I had too many versions. People were building version 2, people were building version 3, people were building it with a Pi 3B+, people were building it with a Pi 4 or Pi 5 or whatever. And I also, for this one, got contacted by the Raspberry Pi Foundation, and they were a company, and they were interested in sending me a Pi 5, because that had just been released. And I thought, well, that's a really good opportunity for me to get rid of that USB accelerator and get rid of the slower Raspberry Pi and kind of redesign the whole thing. So you'll see on the side of the head, not in this shot, but more on the robot itself, there is a new custom PCB that kind of attaches to the side. If you put a PCB on the top of a Raspberry Pi, it's called a hat. This doesn't quite apply. It's more of a flap, but it stays on the side and it holds all of the modules that I want to connect to the Raspberry Pi, and it's compatible with all of the different versions. And so I was really excited to try the Pi 5 and build something that I could give people who could just take the modules and solder them on and be done with it, get it all working. So I started looking at how do I separate these different versions so that people understand? So we came up with the idea of doing named releases. So the first real proper release was the smaller one, and we call that Archie, alphabetical, these names. And Archie was actually the original name. When people would ask me, what do you call your robot? I would say, well, when I'm not swearing at it, I probably call it Archie. And so that was the smaller one. So I created in the software and in the design files a first release and a second release, with the second release being Buddy. And that simplified the whole thing, because now when I was getting questions about how to do things, I could say, okay, well, which release are you actually working with here? And if I release new software and upgrades and new modules, I could specify which of the releases it was compatible with, again, to kind of keep moving that theme forward of making it easy for people to adopt. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about how it worked, because we've covered a few of the different areas, but there's a lot to it. So can I come over here? Are we all right if I swap sides? 6 hours in a box. I really hope this is working okay. So so this is Buddy. And as you can see, Buddy has servo motors on his legs. And the idea here really is that all of these are fairly inexpensive. Now, servos, you can get ones that are a couple of pounds, you can get ones that are 200 pounds. Like, I didn't want to go on that end. And I think as I bought these probably fake versions from a supplier in China, they're a couple of pounds each. They're not really a huge amount, but they do have the right amount of power to be able to power the robot. I 3D printed gears. So the gears would fit on the servos and then connect to each section of the leg. And the idea there was, I didn't know what gear ratio I needed. I wanted it to be modular. I wanted to be able to change it. And that means that if the servos are underpowered, you could potentially change the gear ratio and have it so that you get less range of motion, but more power. So it gives you that flexibility. And you might also notice that the design of it changes as well. And that's because as I was iterating, I couldn't be bothered to reprint and reattach the older part with the new part when I didn't need to. But the top section has been redesigned a few times. You'll also notice that the hip joints will move as well. Now, there's nothing attached to these, but the idea was, and still is to a certain extent, to have an actuator connected to the top as well. And we have somebody who's working on that. So the idea would be, well, if you wanted to balance it on one leg, you could raise one leg up and have the other one like under the center of gravity in order to balance that. So this is all tiny ball bearings and 3D printed parts, and the whole assembly guide is a video. Because I was building this over a course of a few years, there are a lot of videos that explain part of the process as I went through. I don't have a complete build video, but generally, if people are invested enough, they're quite happy to watch the full series anyway, which is quite nice. You can see the attachments for the servos go into the side, and they actually go directly into the PCB that has the Arduino connected just underneath this panel here. And there's also some headers along the top, so you can actually program the Arduino directly from your laptop by plugging in directly to those headers. So as I mentioned, we've got USB-C, we have a toggle switch which switches between off USB-C and then the batteries. And the batteries are just behind this panel, which is 3 18650s. They look like large AA batteries, but they're lithium ion, they're 3.7 volts-ish each. So you get a decent amount of power. It will run it for a few hours. I took it to make a central and it did the day, but I have to admit I turned the Raspberry Pi off for quite a lot of that because that's the big power drain when it's not walking around. And so other than the voltage monitor, that's pretty much everything that's going on in the body. And then the head and neck are connected via a couple of smaller servos. And these are the same servos that I used on the smaller device. And you can see how when when it moves the servo, it actually moves the head as well. And then you have the pan and tilt, obviously, from those two. I ditched the idea of having the neck shrink down into the body because it just ended up being particularly complicated and it would get jammed and so on. Love to be able to do it again, but maybe that's a future version. So for the head, we've talked about the Raspberry Pi. This is a Pi 5, and it actually has the kind of active cooling in place to make sure it's not overheating. It has NeoPixels for the eye, and it also has surface-mounted NeoPixels on the PCB. So the challenge there was actually to be able to get those to work with the Raspberry Pi 5, because when I got it, I didn't realize that half of the things that I wanted to install wouldn't work out of the box because it was too new. So there's a lot of upgrades needed to be done by Adafruit and these other partners who kind of build these modules. It has an I²S microphone, which you don't have to worry too much about that if you don't care, but it's effectively just allows me to connect a microphone via pins rather than via USB. And it also has an I²S amplifier with a speaker that is kind of underneath in the head there. The little red box is actually a voltage, a logic level converter, it's called. And the idea is that your Raspberry Pi communicates, the pins are 3 volts or 3.3, and the Arduino is 5. So if you pass 5 volts from the Arduino into a Raspberry Pi directly, you can potentially damage it because you're passing too much power through. So this logic level converter takes the signal and just switches the voltage up and down depending on which device you're talking to. This is the microwave sensor, which I was talking about before, and it actually detaches just because it's useful for packing and moving around. I'm going to talk to you about the camera in a second, but the camera connects directly to the Raspberry Pi's CSI port. And you'll see a lot of projects use webcams. Generally, that's the easier option. And I struggled for quite a while with a CSI camera and getting the software working and doing all that sort of stuff, but it paid off in the end, which I think is probably on the next slide. And then I think the only other thing that I wanted to talk about was the power and the antenna. So the power, this is a DC to DC converter that takes the battery voltage and converts it down to the exact voltage that the Raspberry Pi needs. There's actually one in the body and one in the head. And that's because when the power comes in, it has one for the body's servos and Arduino and a completely separate one for the Raspberry Pi, which is one of the ways that I found it could cancel out any potential issues when you draw too much power from the servos suddenly, and it kind of does a brownout on the Raspberry Pi and stops it from working properly. It isn't perfect, I have to say. It's something that I'm still working on, but for the most part, it works quite well. The antenna looks cosmetic. It is in this function, but actually, what I can do is I can connect a cable from the antenna to a device, which is a software-defined radio USB module. And what that does is it allows me to scan for digital radio signals. It's the kind of thing that they use on wireless alarm systems or weather stations or even tire pressure monitors. So when I run this, I can see the tire pressures of all of the people in the street and even which kind of model of car they're from and that kind of thing, which I always find quite interesting. So it's something that I don't always connect and don't always use because it does end up looking a bit bulky, but it's a useful thing. And the servo also actuates the antenna so that it can perform some form of animation and emotion and that kind of thing. So yes, I'm going to leave it and we'll turn it on when we're doing questions, if that's all right, because I'm completely terrified that it's going to blow up. So let's leave that one for now. So yes, the one thing that I didn't cover was the AI camera. As I say, initially it was a standard CSI camera. And what that would do is it would just, as cameras do, it would send a video feed to the device, so to the Raspberry Pi. And as I mentioned, for the 3B Plus, that meant that it wasn't real time, it was very power intensive, it couldn't really handle it. The Pi 5 was much better with a standard camera. It meant that you could do more or less real-time facial detection, but it used all of the resources of the Raspberry Pi. So you couldn't do any of the other stuff that you really wanted it to be able to do. And I actually had a conversation with John about next steps on the project. We did a fireside chat a few months ago, and I was telling him that actually what I was thinking about doing was migrating away from the Raspberry Pi and using some other features. And there are other boards that will do onboard recognition of faces and send you the position information via various protocols. Maybe I don't need a Raspberry Pi. Maybe I can avoid all of that. And then, almost as if they heard me, Raspberry Pi released the AI camera. And what this does is it connects to exactly the same port and the same form factor that I had already been using on the project, struggled with for all those years to make sure that it worked well. And it did all of that processing on the camera itself. So it took all of that pressure off the Raspberry Pi and left it free to be able to do other things. So the project went from pretty much real-time face detection to 30 frames a second, guaranteed, no issues. And the Raspberry Pi itself is nice and cool and doesn't use all the battery up and all of that sort of stuff, which was a huge, huge difference for me. And so I pivoted. And as I say, it's been a project of 4 or 5 years. And during that time, the landscape has totally changed on what's available versus what was available when I started. So it's been really interesting to see that. And again, very kindly, the Raspberry Pi sent me a camera. I did have to beg, but I'm not well known enough for them to just send me stuff. But it just worked first time, and it was absolutely beautiful. And unlike the other device that I mentioned where you can get face position information, which is the person sensor, I think, this one you can actually tell it what you want to detect. So you can do pose detection, or you can do any number of other things. Now, I haven't gone that far with this because actually object detection is all I'm really looking for. And what I'll do is I'll tell it to check the kind of object it's detecting. And if it's a person, rather than focusing on the center of the object, I want to focus on the top third and in the center vertically. And the idea then is it kind of looks like your face. So it sees all of you, but it focuses roughly where your head would be, if you like. And that's just been a really interesting change. So one of the other things that I wanted to do in that guise of making it accessible, and not only that, but making it easy for me to manage, was take that jumble of code that I'd assembled over the last 4 years and turn it into something that was pretty usable, hopefully. Now, I am a software engineer. I consider myself an architect. I don't do real-time systems, so I'm probably not a very good real-time system architect, but I understand the concepts and I want to kind of put those in place. So this new approach, and this was my Christmas period, this was while my wife was relaxing, I was sat on the laptop doing this, allowed me to split all of those individual functions and modules into their own modular configuration. So each module has 2 files. It has a config file and it has the Python that runs it. And that's it. So the config file does 2 things. We have an installer script. So all you've got to do to get this working is you download the code and you run the install script. And it will take all of the modules that are enabled, so you can toggle them on and off depending on which ones you want to use in your project. And it will understand what the dependencies are. And if any of you have ever worked with Raspberry Pis and installing Python dependencies and Unix dependencies and all of that, you'll know that it can be a bit of a nightmare to understand what you need. It lists the dependencies, it installs them all automatically. And if there is additional config, it will tell you what that is because that's also defined in the config file. So you run the installer, you check there's no errors, you do that additional little bit of tweaks that you might need to do, and then the robot is ready to go. If you then want to enable another module, you enable it in the config, you run the installer again, and it just installs the stuff that was missing from that new module. So it's a really clean, hopefully, an easy way to allow people to get started with the framework, and not only on this project, but on other projects as well. So if you decide you want to make a rover that has wheels, you build the wheel module, you install it, you run it, it's good to go. But all of the other stuff is instantly usable. Now, I did look at things like ROS, the robot operating system. I did look at things like VM. I've done a couple of sponsored videos with VM for any of you who've seen the channel. And they're really powerful tools. But the challenge is the barrier to entry on these robotics frameworks is really high. And for people who are starting out, a lot of the people who are following my channel are guys who are, 17 years old, who are really just getting into this stuff. And I can't say to them, you need to learn ROS, and you need to have a laptop that will run ROS effectively, which, by the way, is like Unix, certain flavors of Unix. Everything else is really difficult. I bought that laptop in order to run ROS. That's the only reason why I don't have a MacBook standing in front of me. So it's one of those things that this framework is really lightweight and really quick to get going, which is really one of the things that I wanted to do. So the second thing that those modules do is when you run our startup script, it goes through and it grabs all of the modules that are enabled. It understands how they interact with each other, and it loads them all and gets them running. And they communicate with each other using a design pattern in software called the publisher-subscriber pattern. And the idea behind that is really quite simple, is that one of those modules will say, for example, I found a face. Here's the information about the face. And it doesn't need to know who consumes that, who does anything with that. It just sends the information out there. And then if the tracking module, which is a separate thing, is interested and is active, that can receive that signal, that message with that data, and actually understand, okay, there is a face and it's about 20 degrees to the right, so I'm going to move 20 degrees to the right. But the tracking module doesn't move by itself, of course. It sends its own signal to tell the servos to move a certain amount in order to interpret that. So you get that encapsulation of all of those different modules, and they can communicate with each other as much as they need to. And it's all synchronous, so we're not worried about things happening in parallel that would cause problems because of order of execution. I'm getting into software too much here now, so I apologize for those of you who aren't interested. But I felt that this was a really good direction to go in with the project, because it really gave me the option to say, okay, look, I've made it more complicated for me, but for everybody else, it should be a lot more easy to use. And then finally, if people want to build their own modules, now there's a page to read. You create a config file, you create a Python, which typically is going to start from an example script on the internet anyway. So you dump it in there and you run it, and then you're good to go. So use cases is an interesting thing, because I have something like 20-odd thousand people on Instagram following the project, and a few hundred of them have joined the Discord. And the Discord is where all of the conversation happens about people who are building their own. And the things that they have decided that they're going to make out of this is really interesting to see. One of my favorite ones is entertain the cat. And the idea is it has object detection, it detects a cat, it turns a laser pen on in the head, randomly moving around while the cat chases it. And then if the cat is not in the frame anymore, it's gotten bored and wandered off, so it turns the laser off and goes back to sleep. I thought, what a brilliant idea to be able to do that kind of thing. And actually, one of the things that I didn't mention was those white boxes on the side of that green PCB on the head are actually connectors that you can connect additional modules to. So I did this. I created not a laser pen, but a laser line. You can get a module that just prints a line, that displays a line in red laser. And I made effectively a laser scanner so that you could point it at something and say, scan that thing, and it would turn the laser on, kind of scan up and down. Because again, that's what the character does in the game, and I thought it would be quite fun. Unfortunately, one of the guys on the forum decided that he was going to make a high-powered laser to set fire to things, so I had to kind of cut that one off quite quickly, because I don't want it involved with any of that sort of stuff. So yeah, you can see a few examples there anyway. And time-lapsing is something that I have done when I've taken it to events. It's not running a time-lapse today, but it can do, and it can compile all of that together and give you a video feed at the end of it, which is quite cool. So I've already mentioned the community, but I wanted to just highlight that there are a number of ways that people get involved with this, if anybody is interested. We have things like the GitHub repository. GitHub is where we store all of the code. There is a massive wiki on there that explains how it all works. And there's also a forum where we talk about ideas and future developments. And that's the real meaty topics all happen on there. We have Discord, which is more around getting up and getting started and kind of sharing ideas and sharing their own builds as well. So you'll see there's quite a few builds on there. And then my typical stuff where I would share things, which is Instagram and YouTube. Things like threads. I don't get on many of the other ones. I don't know how they work. I feel like I'm too old. And then I have a website which I put together recently, which is makerforge.tech. And the idea was I had too many links. I just wanted a single place. But I also post my learnings in a more abstract way. So things that I've struggled with, this is the fix. You know, it doesn't work in this version, but if you run this hack, it will bypass it and it'll work. And then more concepts around the software that isn't necessarily just about getting up and running with this project, which would be in the wiki. So I mentioned that people are using this project. I mentioned that they're building it. And I mentioned that it had a really positive effect on me to see that. A couple of, maybe a year or so ago, I got a message from Amir. And Amir was based in Turkey. Now, I don't know if you remember, but a little while ago, Turkey had some quite bad earthquakes and it displaced quite a lot of the population in those areas. Amir sent me a message from Turkey in his tent where he was working with a 3D printer to build the project. He was 16 at the time, I think, but really very, very passionate about the project. And he has by far been one of the biggest supporters and one of the biggest contributors. He's actually a moderator on Discord as well now. And he not only built his own version, but took it a step further and started adding different battery types. And you can see it looks very, very similar, but nowhere near what mine looks like, because he's even using a different single board computer in the head and kind of trying all these things out. But the reason why I mention him isn't so much for the project, but for the opportunity that I like to think it gave him, because he went from not having any experience, much like me, and now he works in a company working with AI consultancy because he did this project. He used it as a portfolio piece. He met one of the leaders of his local council, and he was in the paper and all this sort of stuff. And it opened doors and kind of made him feel that this stuff was more accessible than it maybe would have been otherwise. And I was really proud to be part of that, however little part this project played. Another really good example is Joe, and Joe is based over in the US, and he's actually not only building it, but he's working on making it walk. Now, Joe does work with robotics professionally. I have a lot more confidence in him being able to do this than me, but he's actually working on kind of adding not only linear actuators for positioning and things like that, but also sensing so that we can sense the position of each of the servos, which is one of those things that you really need. Imagine trying to walk when your legs are numb. You would have no real... So one of the things that he's doing is kind of building his own version to kind of move in that direction. And it's really exciting to see that contribution going into the project. So next steps for me, I've got a lot of things that I want to do with this, and I don't have a lot of time. One of the things that came out recently was the Compute Module 5. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Raspberry Pi ecosystem, a Raspberry Pi and a Compute Module, the only real difference between them is that the Compute Module doesn't have all of the ports. So it's slimmed down, and that's what that little thing is on the top. So the form factor, it's maybe about that size. And what it does is it has connectors, a very, very small row of 2 connectors along the bottom on the underside, that you can connect typically to industrial boards. So people will use Raspberry Pis in the form of compute modules in industrial applications. Now, I don't use, as you may have seen, any of the USB ports on the back unless I'm connecting that software-defined radio. And I don't particularly use any of the kind of things besides the camera and that sort of thing. So what I wanted to do was say, well, can I shrink this down? And can I, by doing that, also make it more accessible? So these boards that you plug into the compute modules are called carrier boards. And my goal is to make either 1 or 2 carrier boards that stack like a sandwich. So the first one is going to deal with all of the hard stuff. It's going to deal with the microphone and the amplifier that I have had a nightmare dealing with over the years because of various hardware, software issues. And it's also going to deal with various sort of protocols and the outputs of those protocols. So by that, what I mean is the way that you communicate with the Arduino is UART, or serial, if you like. There is I2C, there is I2S, there is SPI, there is CSI, all of this sort of stuff that you would have to specifically know which pins to connect to and really do your homework in order to utilize them. I want to break them out, and I want to break them out into a smaller form factor, but in a way that I can utilize different things on the project, like connecting the NeoPixels via SPI, or connecting a small round display so that instead of the NeoPixels, you could actually have an eye animation, that kind of thing. So that would be the first board. And then the second board underneath would be stuff that was specific to this project. So things like the microwave sensor, things like maybe servo control of the antenna if I decide to do that. And I'm going to skip LLM for now, but the other thing that ties into is being able to allow people to use devices that they want to use rather than the ones that I've decided I'm going to use. So if you don't want to use a Raspberry Pi, Maybe you don't have to. If you want to use an ESP32 or a Pico or a servo driver to drive those servos directly rather than via your Arduino, you could do all of that if I made it more accessible and made it easier to work with. There's also the option to use serial bus servos, which is rather than everything going into an Arduino or a controller, you have them all connected in series, and it offers some interesting opportunities there as well. So there's the option to include that sort of thing. So I'm quite excited about that. The mess of wires on the bottom left is my current attempt. So you can see this big green board is actually the breakout board that you use to convert your compute module into effectively a Raspberry Pi 5 again with all of those different connectors. And then I've used the GPIO ribbon cable to connect to a number of breadboards that runs all of these modules that I'm testing. So far, it's going okay, actually, surprisingly well. So I think I'm getting my knowledge to a point where I can overcome the obstacles quite quickly, which is quite cool. And then because I can do that and because I can shrink everything down, gives me more options with the head. So this is an example of someone who's actually created this really beautiful design for a head. And I'm very interested in doing something similar to that. I wouldn't be able to do it on this one because I couldn't fit the PCB inside in a clean and meaningful way. Now, LLM is an interesting one because people are on different sides of the fence with this. People think ChatGPT is amazing. People think it's garbage. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think it depends on the use case. But what's curious about it is I've used ChatGPT on this, and it you know, limited scope, it does kind of work. But what I'm interested in is I've already explained that the software communicates between modules using this publisher-subscriber pattern. Well, in the center of that is a file called personality. and it doesn't work. It is a demo piece at the moment where it will randomly do stuff, and it will take inputs from the camera, and it will take inputs from the microphone, and it will try and kind of do something that simulates a sentience. If you swapped that personality script out with an integration to an LLM, you can either do online connecting to ChatGPT or whatever, or you can do local LLMs, although speed is an issue. You could tell it, these are the animations that you have available to you. These are the servos and the range of the servos. This is the various inputs that you have, and these are the messages that you will receive from different modules. Behave in a way that is appropriate to this character in this form factor, and have it trigger from the inputs various animations and various outputs, and create that kind of pseudo-sentience that I would be hoping it would do. Now, I will say, hands up, I've never done this before. I haven't tried it yet. It could be garbage, but it's actually a relatively trivial thing to do. And that comes back to my point about when I started this, that wasn't available. It wasn't even on the roadmap as far as I knew. And then just in the few years that I've been building this thing, there have been so many things like that that have come out and completely changed the way that we as makers can build projects. And not only build them, but build them way more easily than we could do before. And I mean, a thing that's been going on the whole time, you know, the invention of the Arduino has spawned all of this other stuff. And before that, you'd be building everything with discrete components. But it's really interesting to see that we can continue to build on it. It's really interesting to see what the community comes up with this. And I am hoping that this is going to be a long-term project that I kind of continue to focus on. And I really wanted to highlight as well that for me, the goal is not to make this the best it can be, as much as it is to learn as much as I can and continue to iterate, because it's the learning and the trying things out and the building on it that I really enjoy the most. Now, I've deliberately not mentioned that last bullet point. This is a point of contention because pretty much daily I get a message from someone on one of the videos going, can it walk? And it can't, as you will certainly see. And one of those things about making something move around in a space is not just about the physical act of taking steps and turning and all of the complexity around that, but also around navigating the space as well. And so, although I would love to see that happen, it's going to take better minds than mine in collaboration to see that work. But who knows? Because again, so much has changed just in the time that I've been doing this, that it's entirely possible that in a few years' time, things will be more accessible, things will be easier, and that will be possible. And there is a guy who's working on giving it rollerblades so that it can move around without having to walk, which is quite an interesting idea. So there you go. I will turn it on for you guys. It's going to beep, it's going to move around. Hopefully there'll be no smoke. And then if you have any questions for me, I'd be more than happy to try and answer them. So there is a switch on the back. And what you'll see here is, it's already moving, but the Raspberry Pi hasn't started up. And that's because the Arduino has its own animations. The Arduino can work independently, so I can unplug the Pi or turn it off, and it will actually just continue to animate randomly. It then starts receiving signals from the Raspberry Pi, and as soon as it receives signals, which is around about the time the ear starts moving, that higher brain function takes over, and the Arduino won't randomly animate anymore. So the idea is that you can actually have 2 levels of control depending on what you want to do. Now, I have put the ear on too far down because it obviously was in the wrong position, but we'll leave it for now. Yeah. So it has a buzzer. The buzzer is going to be speaking in Braille speak. It has the ear moving. It has facial detection, object detection, and that kind of thing. And actually, if it detects an object and then doesn't move for a while, it gets bored and it starts doing random animations as well. Now, I'm going to put this on upside down because it just looks a little bit silly like that. So there you go. So yes, questions? It's, sorry, yes, hi.
What OS is the Raspberry Pi running?
So the Raspberry Pi is running the default Raspberry, and it was Raspberry, and it's now Raspberry OS or something like that, and it's running the latest default version. Yes, with varying degrees of success, because again, some of these modules aren't compatible with it, so some of them need additional work in order to make that happen, which has been a lot of the delay in me actually rolling out the Pi 5. There you go. So that said hello. I know this because I pre-coded it, not because I understand what it said.
For your published subscribed stuff, do you use a message broker?
No, it is the standard Pi pub sub, and it just fires events around between the various modules.
Okay, thank you.
That was actually a bit I was quite interested in. It's a nice way of building it. Well done, and well done with. So the community's obviously grown a lot. You're talking about. You're not talking about it as your project. You're talking about it as a community project now.
Yeah, I will admit that a lot of the work that's gone on in the community hasn't kind of reached the wider multiple builds kind of situation yet. So a lot of people are trying things, but what we have is we have a variations that we can share, and people can send me, oh, I've done it. So there's a guy who did a different version of the neck that attaches in a better way than the way that I designed. And we've made that available so that people can actually download it and use it themselves. And then when we do the next version, which is going to be Cody, any of those improvements that we want to include, we can just include in the default build.
I mean, I had a similar question on that theme. I think you said that we are working on adding actuators for the shoulders for that. So, I mean, is that other people from the community? And like, do you think of yourself kind of team?
I think so, yes. So everything that you see here is work that I've done. But the wider community has I mean, there's a guy who's working on one with 4 legs. Gives you an idea of like the scope of, and not everybody wants one with 4 legs. So it's difficult to know what to include in the default build and what not to. So there is a ton of variation going on within the community. Some of that makes it in, and some of it stays as a kind of orbiting project. But that's the beauty of things like GitHub, because you can fork the existing source and you can make a modification and keep that separate, or you can say, I want to pull this into the main one and kind of incorporate it in a further design. So yeah, a bit of both, I think.
You find yourself sort of maintainer of the kind of the main project, like the sort of the Linus of the robot world, whatever.
That would be the dream. Imagine if I could sit back and see all of these beautiful modifications coming in and just try them out for myself. That would be amazing. Yes.
Did you run any of the kinematic simulation? If yes, which software did you use? And is the simulation code available online?
Not simulation. So again, I focus on the things that are fun to me. I just couldn't learn it all in the time. I wanted to get it built I wanted to get it working. I wasn't, bear in mind, focusing on getting it walking. So the simulation stuff wasn't really a focus. We have got a few people who have done simulations of similar things, but we've never taken it to the point where it's the URDF file, I think it is, of this module kind of going into a simulator. Inverse kinematics is in place on the legs. By the way, you'll notice it's not standing up. There is a switch that I've hardwired into the back, which goes, it's effectively like a restraining bolt, so it can't use the legs at the moment. But when I'm not distracted, I will turn it on and it will stand up. And the idea is that it understands the height of the legs so that it can actually adjust, and that's based on an inverse kinematics model. I didn't get as far as to make it take steps and that kind of thing, because again, not necessary. I have enough trouble keeping it upright in a stationary position. Yeah.
Hey, I was just wondering what kind of things you've done with the facial recognition. So say it recognizes you, does it do anything special because of it's you?
Yeah, so facial recognition isn't in this version, I will admit, but it's an archive module that we could bring back in, but the smaller one had it. And what it would do is it would recognize about 4 or 5 people, which were my family. And so if it was me, it would probably ignore me or maybe track faces, because you can only get it reacting to you so many times before it gets a bit tedious. But I made it so that if it recognized my daughter, it would just go crazy, because at the time she was the age that she absolutely loved that. And I thought that was a good litmus test of saying, if she believes that it is a real thing, then maybe I've succeeded in my goal. You know, it's difficult to get adults to go, oh my God, it's alive. But, you know, she was 5 or 6 at the time, and it was like a really nice thing to be able to go, look, you know, it's talking to you. And it would look at her and it would beep, and it actually said a name, but said it in Braille speak. So she could hear the same tones. God, he's actually saying my name and that kind of thing. So really interesting, but it's quite a reliable thing. The problem is, if it doesn't know a face, it a bit like ChatGPT with hallucinations, kind of goes, you're not one of the 5, so I'm going to guess you're this one. You know what I mean? It doesn't kind of go, I don't know who you are specifically, and that's part of the challenge.
I see. Super cool.
Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm just looking through my lens now and what usually happens when I take on projects, but are there any memorable fails from the project? In terms of, you know, we've had guests speak before, kind of modding Game Boys and all sorts, and you know, I think we can all relate to the shorting it, frying it, crashing it. You know what I mean? It feels like with this project, you mentioning, I feel like there's maybe a pain point there about it falling over, and maybe that's happened before and things like that. So, you know, obviously a lot of time and work goes into it. So I'm just interested to kind of how that journey's been as well.
I just watched a video on YouTube of a guy who created a PlayStation 1, or had an old PlayStation 1 and added all these mods to it. And then the very last step, he connected a switch, but he did it on the 8-volt line instead of the 3.3 or something, and like nearly fried the whole thing. And he'd spent weeks putting all this together. And I totally appreciate that. I thought today might have been it, because it doesn't travel well, but we seem to be okay so far. But the thing is, I haven't ever burnt out a servo or blown a component, because I'm absolutely terrified that if I make a mistake, the entire thing will go. And it will. You know, if I pass too much power through a pin, it will fry everything, and I can't afford to buy it again, or at least I couldn't in the early days. I have a little bit of sponsorship now with like PCBWay and videos like that, which is quite cool. One of the scary things about it, though, is I did connect. So the 18650s are in a battery box with springs, you know, typical battery box thing. And it was upright. It had a couple of wires, and I disconnected the wires from a screw terminal back in the early days. And of course, they just touched together as it was sat on the box. Instantly, the spring turned white and melted, dropping the battery and dropping the connection. Otherwise, I would have been lobbing it out the window, which is my backup plan. My desk has a window. I'm just going to throw it into the garden. But that was the word. But that was a real eye opener. So now, again, as part of this, all of the connections are DuPont connectors, where you can actually have a male-female connection, and I make sure that the battery and anything feeding power is a female connector, so that it can't touch something, you know, go against a piece of metal and fuse or anything like that. The only exception is where you connect the battery to the power circuit, it can go in more than one direction, because I can't fit a directional connector in there. And every time I connect it, I'm absolutely terrified. And it's also because I've done it where it's the wrong way around on one of them. So you've got to check the wire coloring. And that's what I was half expecting to happen here, is that in the hurry, I plugged it in the wrong way around and it'll just go pop. So yes, so far so good, but I'm gonna touch wood on that one.
No, yeah, it sounds like a daft question, but I think, like you say, there's little learnings there, like you say, for other people, as well as maybe some fun stories and things.
My wife would not like it if I burnt the house down. I think that's a hard no from her. So yeah, I have to be careful.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I've got another one online, which I think I know the answer to. But what advice do you have for a software engineer hoping to switch to robotics engineering full time?
See, here's the thing. I'm not a professional robotics engineer, and I don't know how to get my knowledge to a state where I can do that. I built this, but if I go into an interview with professional robotics companies, they're not going to be interested because it's all ROS and it's all the expertise that you have gained with the time that you've done the work. So I have a general hobbyist knowledge. That's how I would consider this. I think in terms of getting into it as a career, I would probably have gone down a completely different path. If you're a software engineer and you want a career in robotics, learn ROS too, because everybody seems to be using that. And if they're not using it, those skills are transferable. And that's basically the idea. So it's a really interesting one, but yeah, nobody's come up and offered me a job in robotics. Let me put it that way.
Cool, thank you.
And what does your daughter think of the robot, and has she got bored of it?
Yes. But I will say, in her defense, she is 9 and she has a phone, and she watches her phone and does very little else. And so I feel as though it was more of a thing for when she was younger. And now she's curious. But what's interesting is now, I'm making a joke that she is actually quite interested, because she comes in while I'm working on things and she's asking me, so what are you doing? What are you working on? I kind of explain it in, how do you explain this stuff to a 9-year-old? But I explain it in ways that I hope that she'll understand. And she asks questions and she shows an interest. And I mean, one of the things that I would really like about this as an outcome would be that she would be interested in making some stuff herself. Doesn't have to be robotics, doesn't have to be electronics or 3D printing, but like just being able to create something yourself rather than being somebody who just consumes things is a really rewarding thing. And it's something that I've learned more from this, I think, than from software engineering, because software engineering, it's very difficult to show that off, if that makes sense. In fact, my family doesn't care that I've made massive web applications for huge companies. They understand this. And when my wife's grandparents saw this, because someone shared a link for them, they were blown away. But they don't get what I do and professionally. So it's quite a nice thing to see something that you've built and have people recognize it and understand and be impressed by it, I suppose.
Awesome. If we don't have any other questions, did you want to try and unrestrain the robot? Can we test your nerves a little bit? Because
so there is a reset button on the Arduino. So what will happen is I'll flick the switch and nothing will happen. Hey, and then when I press the reset button, it resumes its original action. So what should happen really is that the robot will do its thing. It will reset the head, and then it will start to stand. And I'm going to support it behind, because you saw version 1 could stand unassisted. This one, the servo positions are just leaning back ever so slightly. And then the Raspberry Pi will probably take over again. So you'll see it stand, hopefully, unless I need to turn the Pi off first. So let's give that a go. It's still terrifying. I've been doing this for years. So there you go. So it stands up and you can see it kind of falls backwards. But then it actually has an IMU, an inertial measurement unit inside, which keeps balance of the body. So the head doesn't have one, but the body itself knows that it's level. So if you were to tilt it, it would actually react to that change and set itself right. And so what it now does is it freezes the position. What I did have originally was it would, when it moved the head, it would also like just move the legs a little bit. So there was just a little bit of a reaction to it. But it doesn't do that now, because again, it would fall over, but it would fall over just when you got comfortable that it wasn't going to. And up until recently, the neck was only hot glued on. So every time it fell over, the head would pop off and then you'd have all that to deal with. But yeah, there you go. It works. Brilliant.
Dan, I love the head movement when you reset it. That sudden sudden movement of the servos as the Arduino doesn't know where they are.
Yeah. So
it's the classic thing on these robots.
You did a video, didn't you, where you could hack the servo to understand its position? And I would love to do that, because imagine rather than you going, oh my God, what's it doing? It would know before it tries to move anything, the head's currently turned to the right, and just gently bring it back around to the center. Just because of something like that, it would be beautiful.
I did, because obviously there's a little pot inside the servo, and you if you can just put an additional line onto that and put it straight into a analog to digital converter, and you can see it. I killed a servo doing it, so that was the second one, but I did that too. The first one didn't go back together in one piece.
Yeah, well,
they're not really designed to be
sacrifice for science, isn't it? Beautiful. Okay, I can leave that running if you want to do anything else.
Yeah, perfect. No, I mean, yeah, if you want to put your nerves back in the box, you can more than happily restrain it. If
the good thing is,
just so that you can
and just tell
relax.
it not to anymore, and it will jump itself back to its original position. If I can find my button in here.
And I completely understand, the nerves around it. There's a lot of time and effort's gone into there, especially like you say, when it can be a little jerky. So yeah, huge round of applause. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you.
Awesome. So that concludes this evening then. Do we need to, I don't know if I need slides for the end. Nah. Is there anything on the slides? Yeah, the next one is the 25th of March. So yeah, there's be a bit of time between them. So yeah, plenty of time to work on badges, projects, get thinking about, other stuff you want to be working on. As John said, we are looking for sponsors and things to keep this free for everyone. So if anyone works, it's usually, the amount that we're looking for is not huge. So if people want to get involved, but worried about that kind of thing, please do speak to us, because every little helps. And yeah, we normally take things over to the cricketers now, or the back line, just to kind of continue conversation, ask more questions, whatever. So yeah, hopefully you'll join us there. But yeah, other than that, thanks for coming, and hopefully see you on the 25th. Thank you very much.